So, a very warm welcome to everyone present here. Thank you so much for joining in on time. And welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining our platform. And just before we get started, I would just like to give a brief introduction about Sir for everyone who's joined in. And while we were researching about him and getting to know about him, we were amazed at the amount of things that he's able to do. He has so many multiple talents. He graduated initially as a marine engineer and sailed the high seas for a few years before changing course to civil services. And now, of course, he's on social media. He's a YouTube celebrity, has about 1.3 lakh subscribers on his Jaipur Dialogues channel. And he also holds a master's degree in economics, software, and Indian classical music, plus a degree in law. So, in spite of his busy schedule with the government, Sir has also been a prolific columnist and who spares no punches in his hard hitting pieces on contemporary topics. He has deep interest in Indian languages, culture, history, and philosophy, and hence he's written on those topics in his multiple books. He also heads, of course, as I mentioned, the Jaipur Dialogues as a chairman. His first book was Krishna Gopeshwara, and he considers Krishna to be the highest embodiment of Indian human subconsciousness. It was followed by Krishna Yogeshwara, and Krishna Parmeshwara will be the final part of the Krishna trilogy. He has now published an authoritative book on the nullification of Article 370 and CAA. So, this is the book that we will be discussing about today. And all three of his books that have been published so far have been bestsellers. So, congratulations on that, sir. We're really privileged to have you with us on our platform today.
Thank you so much for having me on your platform.
Welcome, Sanjay ji, on our forum. It's a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. Sanjay ji, I must admit, I am a very, very big fan of yours. In fact, we have followed Jaipur Dialogues and have always been fascinated by your passionate topics and the way you conduct the interactions with so much of knowledge and command over topics that you touch. Today, in fact, we are discussing Sanjay ji's latest book, which is Unbreaking India, Decisions on Article 370 and CAA. In fact, this is the book that we are talking about. It's a beautiful book. I've read it and I couldn't really put it down. And congratulations once again, Sanjay ji, for really coming out with such a major book. And I feel it should be a must read in all the schools and colleges and all the younger generation and everyone like us also. And if all age groups should read it, I don't think there is any particular age group to this book. And in fact, it's a remarkable and awesome read. And I'm sure all of us will go and buy it and read it and come back with all the reviews on Amazon, Garuda Prakashan. In fact, Garuda Prakashan is the publication.
And the book is about Article 370 and CAA, but it is just not an account of what happened right now or what happened over the last 2 years. It's a very detailed, scholarly, historical account. So anyone who's interested politically, historically, should definitely go and read the book. So just to start off, sir, I have to ask you, what was, your first idea? Why did you decide to write about such a volatile topic specifically? What made you, delve into this subject in so much detail?
Okay, what happened was that when this Article 370, the architecture of Article 370 was getting dismantled, and then the amendment to the Citizenship Act was being done. And at that time, all the debate that was happening around it, I found most of it pretty shallow. Why I found it pretty shallow was that whatever debate was happening was not really taking it to the root, and the root actually lies in the pre-partition politics of India. And that pre-partition politics of India is actually rooted in the Islamic scholarship that has prevailed in India at least since the time of Aurangzeb. And without having an in-depth look at the basic doctrines which led to the partition, and even after the partition, the discourse did not change. And it is that non-change of discourse that is actually that seemed to be informing the debate that was happening around Article 370 and the CAA. Nobody went to the background of why 370 happened, which was actually never required, and it was lobbied for by Sheikh Abdullah. In fact, the other day, I heard after the book had been actually it was actually in the press. Otherwise, I would have incorporated that statement by Dr. Karan Singh as well. Because Dr. Karan Singh came on record and said that the state of Jammu and Kashmir never asked for Article 370. And that's absolutely what I've written in my book, because it was some kind of a private consultation between Sheikh Abdullah and Jawaharlal Nehru. The state of Jammu and Kashmir never officially asked for it, but Sheikh Abdullah privately lobbied for it. And Sheikh Abdullah was the potentate at that time. Whatever one might say, that even after having a military action in Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad was still made for another 8 years. He was the Raj Pramukh, or the titular head. In fact, that it was more than titular head for the what is called the Part B states that were incorporated in the constitution and later on made into states at par with all other states. But the Maharaja of Kashmir was not given that status, even though he acceded, whether under duress or under compulsion or for whatever, but he did accede to India under the same terms as every other state. You know, there are so many unnecessary quibbles that surround the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India. And I found that a lot of them, because of the noise that is accompanied, that they are accompanied with, they seem to find a greater currency in the current discourse than the actual situation. Like, for instance, just an example, they say, okay, all the apologists for Article 370, including almost the entire liberal class, I think some of them, or rather a majority of them, seemed either totally ill-informed or actually trying to conceal facts. They say that, okay, there was a conditional accession. I think you must have heard this fact about it, okay, that Jammu and Kashmir accession to India was conditional. But damn it, the conditional accession was a fact for each one of the 560 odd states. Each one of them signed the same instrument of accession. And why? Because it was a legal instrument that was contained in the Government of India Act 1935, Schedule 11. So nobody could have signed a different instrument of accession. What they seem to forget is that the instrument of accession was only just the beginning, and it ultimately resulted in different what is called instrument of mergers or merger agreements within states. For instance, all these states of Punjab, they first signed a merger agreement within themselves to merge into what is called PEPSU, and then finally accepted the Constitution of India and became full-fledged Part B states in the Indian Constitution. Now, nobody seems to talk about this in respect to Jammu and Kashmir. They just keep beating around that bush. Okay, no, it was conditional. It was conditional. It was conditional for each of the states that acceded to India, because it was a legal instrument. And that legal instrument was the same for everyone. So these are the small things that were being so completely misinformed or ill-informed, that I thought that a complete look at what happened, not just around 370, but even the background before that. So when you're talking about Article 370, you have to talk about the philosophy of Sheikh Abdullah, involvement of Sheikh Abdullah in the 1931 riots in Srinagar, then involvement of the various Sufi tariqas and silsilas in converting the Valley of Kashmir and remove this cobweb around this peaceful Sufi, or the Sufism being the great creed of Jammu and Kashmir, looking at what the entire pre-partition politics and the so-called peaceful Sufis of the Barelvi sects did with Jinnah, and how they participated actively with Jinnah to dismember India. All that needed to be actually put down in writing with proper references. And same with CAA. Why the need for CAA arose? What was the Liaquat Nehru Agreement? Why did Liaquat Nehru Agreement happen? What was the background to that? What happened during partition? Why did partition happen? And they look at the pre-partition politics, the Muslim pre-partition politics, and then comparing it with the post-partition politics in the Muslims, and with references, with instances, with concrete examples, coming to the conclusion that it remains the same even today, and that is why the anti-CAA riots happen. So this, I think I can generally summarize as far as the book is concerned.
So about the book, apart from the fact that it is so, I find the chapters small and it's very readable book and everything. One thing which has been really fascinating people is the cover. And this fascinated me also. And I felt that when I talk to you, I must ask you about this. So you have to tell the viewers and everyone present here and everyone who will see us on the YouTube channel later. And how did you think about this cover? This is very interesting.
This is actually the idea of Pakistan, as I have said multiple times. I've said in this book also that Pakistan is not the name of a territory. Pakistan is the name of an idea. And that fundamental idea is that the Muslim is born to rule, and therefore even the subcontinent, Muslim has to rule the entire subcontinent. So this map is actually a prelude to the Pakistan resolution of 1940 that happened in Lahore, that in which the Pakistan resolution was taken. So Rahmat Ali, Maulana Rahmat Ali was the one who prepared this map, and he called it the Commonwealth of Pakistan. So in this Commonwealth of Pakistan, what he visualized was that according to the theory that I have quoted Khwaja Hassan Nizami in the book, where he says that it is the Musliman who is born to rule, and the Hindus are effete and cowards, and they have never ruled. And the British took India from the Muslims, which of course is a factual lie completely, because the British took India basically from the Marathas. Then this is something that they built upon, and all the time they kept harping on it. Then they prepared this map, and they said that this is the shape of India that they see. And of course, the communists got together with them and gave them the intellectual heft. And they also said that Pakistan, of course, was justified on the basis of religion. They're atheists, by the way, they profess atheism. But Pakistan was justified on the basis of religion. But the rest of India needed to be divided into 17 parts on the basis of what they called ethnicity. Now, sometimes they even brought racial theories into it. Until today, they harp on the Aryan Dravidian and all kind of divisions. And now, of course, that economic communism is dead. So they have brought into picture the cultural Marxism and the postmodernism and all those kind of divisive theories. So one divisive theory fails, then they bring in another divisive theory. Because Islam, Christianity, and communism, all the three are based on binaries, and the binaries do not work unless you bring one divisive theory or another. So Maulana Rahmat Ali brought in this map, and you see the names also. So the name of the Prophet is there, and the name of all the four first Rashidun Caliphs are there. You'll see what is called Siddiqistan for Abu Bakr. You will see an Usmanistan for Usman. Then you will see probably Farooqistan for Umar Farooq. And you will see a Hadaristan for Ali. So all the four Rashidun Khalifs are present. Of course, Bengal is Pakistan. And you see the swaths, even Delhi is included. And that reminds me of Liaquat Ali's statement, who said that, okay, Delhi and Meerut are inalienable parts of Pakistan. You cannot have a Pakistan without Delhi and Meerut. So when you see the implacable and intractable behavior of Pakistan, it is because that idea still lives on. Because what they got ultimately as Pakistan was far less compared to what they had dreamt about. And that's why Jinnah said that what we have got is a moth-eaten Pakistan. And that theory of Pakistan, which is called Pakistaniyat, or it is called Nazariya-e-Pakistan. And Nazariya-e-Pakistan basically means what is called Do Qawmi Nazariya, or the two-nation theory. The two-nation theory, ultimately, they validated it in the 80s by calling it Milli Tashakhus. They just gave it another name. Basically means the same thing, that Muslims cannot be ruled by anyone else, because their philosophy guarantees them the supremacy of the earth, so they cannot live under anybody else. So they need a separate identity. So Milli Tashakhus, and that is why all that Shabano and all that happened. And that resulted in a huge reaction. And I think rise of BJP is related to that. Then in the CAA, that same Milli Tashakhus, if you heard all the slogans that were going on in the anti-CAA agitation, then they called it Mazhabi Pehchan. It's exactly the same thing, that same separatist idea, that same Pakistani idea. Pakistan is an idea. Pakistan is a separatist idea. Pakistan is a supremacist idea. And that is actually pandered to and fostered by all our what I call the Ashrafia Mullah Maulana class. The liberals do not understand it because they look at everything from the Western lens. They haven't bothered to study Urdu, because if they had studied Urdu and if they were reading Urdu newspapers, then they would read these narratives being peddled about in the Urdu newspapers every day. I have the benefit of knowing Urdu, reading, I can read Urdu, and that is why I can take on somebody like Shahid Siddiqui, who acts like a secular on the television, but in his Nayi Dunya Urdu, he actually peddles all these separatist ideas. So that is the secret of this map which you see. This is Rahmat Ali's map, basically. And I've given that, I think it is there in the book inside also, and the source is also given, the reference is also given.
You have a very big appendix, all the sources that you've mentioned. And I mean, I must tell everybody present that it's a wonderful book. Apart from that, Sir has mentioned a lot of references, and it has a very big appendix too.
Talking about the anti-CA agitation. So a lot of what you have written in your book is very well researched and very well detailed, things that I had no idea about growing up, that were not taught in historical books, in our history books. And that was very interesting to read. But coming to the present scenario, I was here in Delhi when the protests were going on, December to February. And, as a member of the general public, someone who was back then specifically not aware of what the history was, all we were aware was, the social media post or the newspaper articles. That was the maximum extent of our information. So looking back then, I remember there were 3 prominent incidents that, that I can pinpoint that I had sort of etched as the symbol of the protest. One was, of course, the roadblock at Shaheen Bagh. Then there was the Jamia Millia incident. And then, of course, there was the riots in Shiv Vihar in February. And all of that sort of left me with an impression that, protests are necessary in a democracy. People need to voice their opinions, but these kind of incidents keep happening. And these kind of incidents sort of, if, at least in the minds of us, they sort of, lose value for the government, that how they are being handled. So looking back, so you've speculated so much about these articles. How do you consider these kind of volatile protests can be handled, and how is it that all of this can be handled in a much better manner? Because clearly there's so many incidents that say that it was a poorly managed protest overall, specifically from the government and the police's side. What is your opinion about that, sir?
In fact, that was one of the reasons that impelled me to write this book, because I thought a lot of people in the government also missed the trick. And they should have studied the pattern as it used to happen pre-partition. This was exactly the same pattern. And I will read that chapter from the book. I think that about sums it up. And this is, I think, chapter 1 itself. And there is chapter 1 and chapter 2. There are two instances which I pointed out, and that I think needs to be read. Okay. I said, quoting H.V. Seshadri, page 20, chapter 1. Sitaram Goel writes in his seminal book, Muslim Separatism, Causes and Consequences. This is a 1995 book. Just read this small para. So that, to start with, we want to take up what we consider to be its most important contribution, namely the unraveling of two behavior patterns, Muslim and national. Mind you, he's talking about the pre-partition behavior, which collaborated closely for years and precipitated partition in the final round. The Muslim behavior pattern was characterized by acrimony, accusations, complaints, demands, denunciations, and street riots. Okay? The national behavior pattern, on the other hand, was characterized by acquiescence, assent, cajolery, concessions, cowardice, self-reproach, and surrender. And my argument in this book is that nothing has changed. It continues to be exactly the same. And I think that is where the national leadership seems to be missing a trick. They are not trying to go deep into it, and they're not trying to understand this behavior pattern, that this has not changed. This is not changed because the basic slogan is not changed. The basic slogan, what used to be the Muslim separatism, that they said that there are two nations, there are two nation theories, and they said there are two. Why there are two nations? Because once they become a nation, that makes them equal. Because United States and Samoan Islands are equal in the United Nations. They get the same vote. So it doesn't matter whether you have the majority and they have the minority, but because there are two nations, so they are separate and equal. Just being separate is not enough. You must understand they also demand equality once you concede that they are a nation. So now when they couch it into, because two nation theory, of course, is anathema to everybody. So now they couch in a different term. So they brought in Milli Tashakhus. Now it is Mazhabi Pehchan. It's exactly the same Ashraf narrative. You know Ashraf, I hope. The Ashraf is the upper class Muslims who control everybody through an instrument called taqleed. What is taqleed is also mentioned here. Taqleed means that under the Islamic philosophy, aql is the monopoly of the few, the alim ulama and the ruling class, the basically what I call the Ashrafia Mullah Maulana class, AMM. So it is there preserved. Everybody is supposed to follow it, and that is the Islamic doctrine. So that being the Islamic doctrine, they bring in this idea of separate identity again and again and again. And they will keep bringing it unless you, first of all, understand it and where it is coming from. Because I have taken it right down to the Fatawa Alamgiri and their Sufi doctrines, which are Sufi doctrines. They are also preaching separatism. And this fallacy of Sufis being very peaceful has also been completely exploded, and that myth has been exploded in this book. Because I have brought out facts on record that say that most of the violent incidents, why most, almost all, except one small movement, which was called the Farazi movement in Bengal in pre-1857 times. Every street riot, every massacre, every major outbreak of violence, whether it is Malabar, the Mappilas, or it is Noakhali, or it is the partition riots, all of them were headed by and actually birthed by, led by all these Sufi dargahs and peers and their followers. So that is there on record. I challenge anybody to refute it. So your answer to the question that you posed is that the anti-CAA behavior has to be seen in the context of the behavior that prevailed even pre-partition. And my contention is nothing has changed. They are continuing with the same tactics. And you do not seem to understand where you failed. This approach of acquiescence, assent, cajolery, cowardice, self-reproach, surrender is not going to help. You have to confront the bully. You have to confront the bully head on. And you have to tell him that you understand your tactics and this is not going to work in independent India.
Very right, sir. Absolutely. So how much time did you take to write this book? It is such a well-researched book that most of us don't know even 10%.
You will not believe, this book has a history. The book has a history. It was commissioned by Bloomsbury initially.
Yes.
And because I had written a number of articles which were received very well, and a number of those articles are still present on my medium.com blog. In fact, one of them did something like 10 million views, which I had written, I think immediately after 370. It was written on 25th August. It's still there. And it was so well received that actually, in about a few hours, it had done some 50,000 views, and Medium applied a spam filter. They thought that somebody was spamming, because Medium is such a platform where you do not expect that kind of a response. Even 1,000 in 10 hours would be considered great. So it got about 50,000 views in about 5-6 hours. So they applied this spam filter. And I had to struggle with them. Then I took it elsewhere. Then it was published, and then it has been published and republished in so many places that collectively it's done nearly 10 million views. So this gentleman, the publisher non-fiction from Bloomsbury, who had been coordinating my Krishna trilogy, he called me up and he said that, why don't you write a book? Because you've already written so many articles. That you should be able to write it quickly, and we need it quickly. This was in February. So I already had so much of research material that the first draft was completed in 20 days flat. Rather than keep pontificating from your side that all religions are equal, listen to what they are saying. Listen to the alim and ulama, because they are the authorities on how their religion works, not you. So stop this foolhardiness and listen to what they are saying. You have to accept them as the authority on their religion. Whatever you say is not valid. That is why I have a critique of Mahatma Gandhi also, his view of Islam. I consider it completely flawed. And I mentioned it in this, that his Khilafat movement actually gave legitimacy to the most regressive, this Ashrafia Mullah Maulana class among the Muslims. And the progressive class actually got sidelined because of that. And it was a very odd kind of a movement, in the sense that Mahatma Gandhi was struggling, he was demanding Swaraj for India. And at the same time, he was supporting a movement that was actually to deny Swaraj to the people of Turkey. So this was a very, very strange movement which defies all logic. And that ended up legitimizing this regressive class, and they took it to the stupidity of the national leadership and what I said, the national behavior. And they maximized their gains. And after that, they became even more intransigent. Uh, Not only they became more intransigent, they started making all kind of impossible demands, all kind of maximal demands. And the British were happy to play this game, and our people led as they were led into that trope of ahimsa as something called complete non-violence, and having been led into that trap, they just kept conceding more and more ground, ultimately conceding partition, which if they had not conceded, if they had held firm, then I'm sure the public was ready to fight for a united India. They were ready to fight for it. Ultimately, what happened? You gave them partition, and still all the massacres happened. People got driven out. The people who wanted united India, they were driven out. And the people who wanted a separate homeland, they stayed back. So you got the worst of both the worlds.
Yes.
So right, absolutely, sir. And I must mention here that Unbreaking India right now is the #1 bestseller on Amazon, and it has beaten even Mr. Obama's book. That is very good for us because we get to read, and with all the everybody eager to read the book, I'm sure Sanjay ji, you must be very, very happy about it.
Oh, yes, I did not expect it to. In fact, it has become, it's got listed on Amazon.com in the USA as a #1 new release in one of the categories. So that's even more remarkable because I did not expect people in the US to start reading it so much.
Fantastic, sir. But in any case, you are a man with a golden touch. I mean, everyone here has heard you on. Since we launched this session, a lot of people have been wanting to know how did you start Jaipur Dialogues. So maybe a little bit about your platform, please.
Well, the Jaipur Dialogues was, it has a story again.
Yeah.
It has a story, and it goes to the JLF, the Jaipur Literary Festival. And I did not like the way that they had been kind of dealing with the issues and only privileging one kind of a view, and the kind of swagger and hubris that they showed around. So I had a kind of an argument with William Dalrymple uh, on Twitter, after which he blocked me. And at that time I said that we need our own platform where at least the other point of view can at least be related. So that is how Jaipur Dialogues was born. In the first year, we had 7 outstation participants. That is a total of 8 of us, including me. And it used to be offline. The online presence was very small. And in fact, right till 2018, the number of online viewers that we used to get in any kind of a session was about 20 or 30. That's what used to happen. But then this COVID came as some kind of a blessing in disguise when I decided to shift completely online. And since then, the growth has been phenomenal. Otherwise, also, Jaipur Dialogue had become well known in the literary circles, and people from I used to invite people from all kind of views, I invited Romila Thapar also, I invited Ramchandra Guha also, but then those are the people who only like to speak in their own clubs, so they did not come. And Romila Thapar was around in Jaipur, she did not come. And then I discovered that she has never spoken outside her cozy club. Um, and that is the situation. I even sounded out to people like Irfan Habib and others, but no, they are fine with their dogma. They do not want it questioned in any manner. But a lot of other people came. Shekhar Gupta has been coming to Jaipur Dialogues regularly, except last year. So that's how it started. But then its online transformation has taken place in only about less than a year. But I'm myself surprised the kind of reception it got online. And online, I'm very happy to note that it is about 100 times bigger in number of monthly views compared to JLF. So there we are. And the JLF is finally put in its place.
Congratulations. You have around 1.3 lakh subscribers on YouTube, sir.
Yes, 1.37 as on date. But more important than that, our monthly views are in excess of 3 million.
Fantastic. And in
JLF
fact,
gets about 100,000. So
it is fantastic because the kind of topics that you touch, and I'm quite a frequent, I think I've seen most of your Jaipur Dialogues sessions, and you learn so much on the forum. And in fact, that is what people, really said that, we want to know about how did he start, and yes, we want to know about his book, and we also want to know about Jaipur Dialogues. Thanks for sharing this with us. And one of our last questions, because again, now we have interactive round, and there are a couple of people who have been wanting to talk to you directly. And they have read your books, and some of them really want to have very nice questions for you. One of the most important thing that I've been wanting to ask you always, and I think maybe I'll finish off our conversation round with this, with so much of knowledge and with so much of writing, and you've been in IAS and everything. So how do you get time to read so much? Because that's very important for the readers here to know, for the writers to know, because you're doing so much of reading, that you're discussing so much, you're writing such relevant topics.
if you've read the preface to my first book, I have thanked Mrs. Vasundhara Raje, and in the second one, I have thanked Mr. Ashok Gehlot for giving me all the time I needed, because they thought that my views were rather dangerous to their health, so they kept me on what is called side postings. That gave me a lot of time. So you have to actually thank them for providing me all the time while I was on my job. I retired only in July this year. But then, because I didn't really have much to do, and of course, they could not take away my energy from me. So I employed my energy in reading, writing, speaking, all these things.
Fantastic. Absolutely. And it's been such a good session, and I will come back again, but I will like to request Shreya to start the interactive round. We will begin with Jayavardhan Dedish. In fact, he's the person who, sir, we got introduced because of him to you. He's in fact a student of geography and Indian classical vocalist. He's working with Padma Bhushan Pandit Birju Maharaj, and he's got keen interest in politics and international relations. And he's a big reader of yours and a big follower of Jaipur Dialogues.
Namaskar, sir.
Namaste. Namaste.
It's so good to see you. And I'm so overwhelmed to receive a copy of Unbreaking India. And it's a very interesting read, definitely. Also, I've been a fan of Jaipur Dialogues, and I've been following Jaipur Dialogues since almost an year. After you came on Ishkaran Bhandari's show, after that, I became a fan of yours and Jaipur Dialogues as well.
Okay. I think that was a topic on Sufis.
Yeah, exactly, sir. So my question is quite relevant to that, as been reading the Unbreaking India. You have explained that basically Barelvis as Naimuddin Muradabadi favored out Pakistan and establishing Shariat there, and basically the Nafrat ke Ahkam of the Fatawa-e-Razviya. Why were Deobandis, who basically are responsible for an ideology of Taliban, chose to be the hypocrites of the highest order? What was their master plan in like staying over in India?
Actually, as far as the final goal is concerned, there is no difference of opinion.
Okay.
Both of them have this final target of completely Islamizing the subcontinent. That were identical. In fact, Hussain Mahmud Madni, who was actually the votary of this Qawmiyat Muttahida, or the composite nation theory, as opposed to the Qawmiyat Judagana, or the separate nation theory of the Barelvis. In 1945, there was a Jalsa in Delhi. And in that Jalsa, he's on record having said that we have absolutely no difference as far as our ultimate goal is concerned. And as far as that was concerned, even the so-called nationalists like Hasrat Mohani or Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, even they had no difference of opinion. You can read all the quotations that I've brought out from Maulana Azad. That particular strategy is intact and is identical with both. The difference was in tactics, because Devbandi said that our ultimate strategic goal would suffer irreparably if we partition the country, because then that line of partition would become some kind of a wall which Islam would find difficult to penetrate. That was not just Hussain Ahmad Madni and the Devbandis. Of course, there was a schism within the Devbandis also. And Shabir Ahmad Usmani, one of their major Devbandi cleric, he found his own organization, because they were doing it through what is called Jamaat-e-Ulema Hind. So Devbandis had found this. Hussain Ahmad Madni had founded Jamaat-e-Ulema Hind, through which this Qawmiyat Muttahida was being propagated. But Shabir Ahmad Usmani of Devband, he founded another that is called Jamaat-e-Ulema Islam. And he went his own separate way, and ultimately he went to Pakistan also. Whereas all the Barelvis, they were absolutely firm right from the beginning, because in Fatawa Razaviya, when the Khilafat movement took place, and Ahmad Raza Barelvi was alive. He died only in 1921. So if anybody is care to read Arun Shori's The World of Fatwas, in which this Fatawa Razviya is quoted extensively. Otherwise, it is in Urdu and you don't even find an English translation. They have been so careful to preserve its integrity. So I am getting it transliterated.
Okay.
God, all its
So
volumes, I'm getting it transliterated. So they said that we will do Hijrat, because Barelvis, they are fanatical about Hazrat Muhammad. Their fanaticism is the Devbandi fanaticism and the Barelvi fanaticism are different, in the sense that Barelvis or the Sufis are more fanatic about Hazrat Muhammad, whereas Devbandi fanaticism is about Islam. So they said that we will follow Prophet Sunnat. Sunnat means conduct. And we will do Hijrat, the way he went out from Mecca when he was not able to make much headway there. So he went out of Mecca. He founded his own kingdom in Medina, and later on he came back and conquered Mecca. So we will follow the Sunnat of the Prophet. So the tactics differed. And they said, actually, that's why Pakistan is implacably and absolutely inveterate enemy of India, is in this theory that they have to ultimately fulfill the Sunnat of Prophet, and they have to capture Delhi and re-establish Aurangzeb's Mughal Empire. So the difference is only of tactics, not of the ultimate strategy.
okay, sir, I would like to ask you one more question, just the last question. So as we can see that there's a popular statement that communist is one who reads Mao, but an anti-communist is one who understands Mao. So as we have seen, the postmodernism and cultural Marxism have disastrously impacted the root levels of Indic traditions. So what is the way forward for communists to do Ghar Wapsi, just like Shri Sitaram Goel ji did?
Well, I think we did 2 episodes on this, and one was well, 3 episodes actually. There was one which studied the Soviet Union's recipe, the 4-step recipe for converting a country into communism. That is rooted more in economic Marxism. Then we did an analysis of and within that, we also did an analysis of cultural Marxism and postmodernism. Then we did an episode on the rules of radicals by Saul Alinsky. Then after that, I and Vibhutija, again, we did an episode on counters to Saul Alinsky. The 13 rules of Saul Alinsky and the 20 rules of countering Saul Alinsky. Because ultimately, it is based on a dogma. Communism is also a dogma. It is the binary dogma in this similar manner as Islam and Christianity. So a lot of people who think that it is rational, you have to bring them out and you have to tell them and bring the true picture to them. So a lot of people who are actually misinformed, they can retract and they retrieve. And as it is, anybody who's, because most people who follow communism, generally, a lot of them are rational people. And when the emotional quotient is high, at that time they get trapped by this.
Good evening, sir.
Namaste, Neetu ji.
Namaste, sir. It's been a wonderful session so far. My question is, sir, do you think that the idea of NRC as a whole doesn't make sense, or can it be modified? And if yes, then what changes would you make?
No, I think NRC is a perfectly fine idea. After all, almost every democracy has done it. And all the arguments that are advanced against NRC are all spurious arguments. And they, in fact, NRC has already been enacted.
Yes,
It is the 2004 Citizenship Amendment Act. The NRC is already there. So I don't even know what people are talking about. People talk about things which they don't actually read. The UPA government in 2004 has already brought out the NRC and NPR both. And the first NPR exercise has already been done in 2010. So this bogey that is created that, okay, that they want to throw out certain people and all that, that is, that it is just propaganda. And as Jay was asking, one of the rules of Saul Alinsky is that you do propaganda without feeling guilty about it, that you lie with a straight face. That is the rule of propaganda. So that's what they do. That is one of the standard radical rules. And you cannot tell these people in rational manner. Then you have to use what is called the heavy hand. That's the only way that you can tackle the diehards. Like you can see this farmers' protest, what is happening? Who are all the people who are doing this propaganda? These are all diehard leftists. These are all radicals. So with these radicals, you think you can convince them.
Devanagari script. So where did this love for Urdu come? And second is, what is your future plan? Like, what are you writing next?
My medium.com blog. And that has become quite a rage, and a lot of people are asking for that. So what I intend to do also to expand it and publish it in a book form.
Okay.
That is 2, and the third, of course, I have to complete the trilogy.
Okay.
And the first part was
Urdu.
that the Urdu thing.
Yeah.
No, Urdu actually. I come from Awadh, basically. My roots are from Awadh, so my roots are in Khiri Lakhimpur, which is part of Lucknow division.
Yeah.
And then my parents, they shifted to Lucknow in 1980 or so. So when I was in college, then I think somebody taunted me कि कैसे लखनऊ पे उर्दू नहीं आती. So I think that was the trigger.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
We have Alka Khanna. She's an entrepreneur and also a social worker.
Namaskar, sir. I'm a regular. I watch your Jaipur dialogues and all your other these things. Most of my questions are answered, and I just want to thank you and a couple of other people like you who are just breaking the narratives that have been so ingrained into our systems. And the most scary are people like me, who I call themselves like Kale Angrez, because we studied in English medium schools and learned at heart we are, I think, quite Angrez, not totally Indian. But as we are growing older and learning from people like you, the real stories, and it's really like mera to I feel mera ghar wapsi to ho raha hai, because I believed in God very vehemently, but I didn't think too much about Hindu religion because I was taught to actually feel ashamed about being a Hindu, or, sort of not shamed, but nothing much. So I knew the Bible when I was in class 3 because we had Christian teachers, and I could read the Gutka also in class 7. But I'm just saying, I'm very, very thankful to people like you who I continuously watch. And I feel God give you all more power and let there be breaking of these narratives faster than you all have planned. And I hope the government and the education system also incorporates all your views and the facts that you give. They're very, very good. Thank you so much, sir. And I follow you very, very regularly.
Thank you, Alka ji. Thank you for the kind words.
Thank you, Alka. Now we have Asha Dhamia. She's an educationist and she's an assistant professor of political science. She's working at Delhi Public School.
Namaste, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you.
Namaste, Asha ji.
Yeah. So, मेरा बहुत एक genuine and right from my heart. पिछले 1 घंटे से आपको सुनते हुए, this question I have bombed into the chat box actually. I'm a school teacher. I've been teaching political science and history to senior secondary schools, like senior classes, 10th, 11th, 12th. So for last 15 years, our books, the content in our books are not changed. And that language and the information in the book is of that kind, that national approach attitude you were saying, which is concessioning, which is minoritism, inspired by that, which is cajoling, and which is cowardice, I would say. So by when could teachers like me, who feel very helpless while dealing with such content, when can we have a revised content, the authentic content, the true history, the true politics in our books? How more years?
I think you have a very genuine question, and actually all of us have that question, not just you. And all of us are voicing that, and we are voicing that vociferously. And the one little ray of hope that we see is this rewriting of text that is going to be under the national education policy. In fact, I did a session with Shri Vinay Sahasrabuddhe, who happens to be the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee for the HRD ministry. And there was a reason for that, just not social sciences. even pure sciences, this problem is there. And I don't know whether you've watched that. That happened during that our annual summit 2020. And before that also, I've had 3 or 4 sessions on national education policy. And it is at least my personal effort to keep building pressure on the people who matter, keep sensitizing them to this requirement. And I also keep telling my viewers on Jaipur Dialogues that just electing a government is not enough. You have to be exercising oversight on that government all the time. So you have to keep pressurizing it, and whatever means that you have at your command, you have to keep telling them. In fact, this national education policy would have languished if we had not been applying that kind of a pressure. Because, you know, one of the ministers said that we haven't changed line. Of course, he was wrong. They have changed quite a few things in CRT, but I think why he was saying so was because he was trying to cover up, I think.
Very minor changes. Just few phrases, few paragraphs, not the content itself.
Yes. So I think they probably wanted to do it under some kind of national architecture. So that architecture is not there with us. A lot of us actually participated in that consultative process. The only little problem that I see is that a lot of these committees are still populated by people of my tribe, that is the bureaucracy. And they are the ones who have the least understanding of these national perspectives. So I think what we can do is that we can remain vigilant, and wherever we can intercede in our little capacities, we should, whether on the social media or in conferences or wherever we get an opportunity, because texts are being rewritten officially. So when the texts are being rewritten and we are vigilant and we can find our ways to put our points of view over there, I think the next 2-3 years are very crucial for us, and we should be very vigilant and look for any and every opportunity to put pressure on them to put the correct history. We are not saying that you put history that favors us, but at least remove the whitewashed portions. If there has been a history of Islamic brutality, which their own historians have recorded, then at least give a reference to the book of Eliot and Dawson and say that they say this. Bring back Majumdar, bring back Jadunath Sarkar. Okay, this is the minimum that can be done. And remove these Marxist characters like Romila Thapar, who was a professor of ancient history without knowing Sanskrit. Have you heard of, can you think of a professor of Middle Eastern history in the West who doesn't know Hebrew? He would not get his PhD. And here she is Professor Emeritus of Ancient History of India without knowing Sanskrit. And Irfan Habib, he is a Professor Emeritus of Aligarh Muslim University, eminent historians in the language of Arun Shourie. But of course, Arun Shourie is also gone over to the other side, but he does not disown his books. So this eminent historian doesn't know Persian or Arabic. He's on record that I don't know Persian or Arabic. So these are the people who have done their doctorate and who have done all their work and who have done guided people without knowing the very basics of their craft. So these are the kind of things that we have to take out of our syllabus. That's what we need to keep pressurizing people.
So I would want to take half a minute. One important I would want to share with you. As a teacher coordinator, I took a delegation of German students and Indian students. It was a collaborative project. I took them to Jamia Millia University, and there we had an interaction with the HOD of Islamic Studies, right? So, and during that interaction, while attending to the questions of German students, I would quote, sir, the HOD of Jamia Millia Islamia University, Islamic Studies. He said, Muhammad is not the founder of Islam. Islam is the oldest religion. Adam and Hawa are the founders of Islam. Sir, you can understand, I had to cut such a sorry face when the German students looked at me. This is a scholar, head of Department of Islamic Studies, sitting in a government-sponsored university, twisting the facts. Such extremists. So heavy hand you spoke about, sir. When is the government going to use a heavy hand to stop such kind of dispensing of twisted facts?
Government uses the heavy hand only when it is forced to. I have worked for 35 years in the government, and I know if we can avoid a situation, that's the thing that we will do. And we act when it is, there's no other option. We have to act, so we will have to act. So that is the normal behavior of government. There's nothing abnormal. Whatever government it may be of the green color, red color, saffron color, orange color, blue color, whatever. Every government has that tendency. And again, as I said, that the price, as I said, the freedom does not come free. I think we have this great problem in our country where we think that our freedom just consists in voting. Even that, half the people do not do. That we just go and vote and the government is formed and that's about it. No, eternal vigilance is the price that we have to pay for freedom. And that's something, I think that's where many of us lack. And we will all have to persist and persevere. And next 3 years are very critical. And we have to persevere. And as far as this professor of Islamic studies is concerned, I think if you can have a professor of history without knowing Arabic in medieval India and without knowing Sanskrit in ancient India, then you can always have these kind of people. He is talking from Quran and Hadith, so he is a professor of Islamic studies. If Hadith and their fiqh scholars are saying this, he will have to parrot it. So, you think OSE is an exception? No, OSE only says what the Islamic scholars are saying.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, Sanjay ji. You are so busy, but you still give us time, and we have exceeded our limit though by at least half an hour, but everybody was enjoying the conversation and I didn't have the heart to tell them, please don't ask further. And thank you so much for coming over. It's been such a pleasure and honor for all of us here to listen to you.
Thank you, Neeta ji. Thank you for having me here.